Hi, I'm Dr. Allision Fong, and I'm a research coordinator here at the Alfred-Wegener Institute located in Bremerhaven, Germany. I'm also the MOSAiC Ecosystems Coordinator, and so my interest and my role in MOSAiC is to cover all of the things that fall under the umbrella of ecological processes and functions. And ecology is really at the intersection of both physics and chemistry. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Arctic Ocean, Nutrean Biogeochemistry, its distribution of nutrients in the Arctic Ocean, and how that influences primary production that we hope to be able to observe during MOSAiC. So firstly, let's take a look at what types of physical currents control the introduction and export of nutrients from the Arctic. As you may know, the Arctic Ocean is the smallest ocean, but it's very unique and dynamic because it's surrounded by several continents. So while it's small, its contribution to global climate is ever increasing with global warming. So things that we're looking at are not just the introduction of nutrients from the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, but also the contribution of nutrients and organic matter from terrestrial systems, so from the land masses that surround the Arctic. There are large rivers flowing into the Arctic, and with them, they bring sediments, organic matter, and nutrients. So when we think about what are the distributions of nutrients in the Arctic, we have to consider all of the inputs and outputs. This includes both terrestrial sources as well as oceanic sources. So let's first look at some of the currents. We have a distribution of primary currents from both the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Atlantic, warm, salty water flows in through the Fram Strait. From the Pacific, we have cold, nutrient water coming through the Bering Strait. Together, these currents bring about a change in the ratio of nutrients to one another. And what we do is we study what the proportion of these nutrients are in different regions of the Arctic to understand their distribution and how that distribution supports primary productivity. So in addition to the lateral transport of nutrients into the Arctic from both terrestrial systems and the inlet of the Bering Strait and the Fram Strait to the Atlantic and Pacific, we have to consider what the vertical distribution of nutrients are in the ocean. So currents not only move water laterally, but they move water vertically. And understanding the physics behind how the ocean is structured gives us insight into how nutrients are distributed from the surface to the deep ocean. And so one way of understanding what might control nutrients is the temperature and salinity of seawater. And in the Arctic Ocean, you also have to think about the layer of ice that exists on top of the ocean, which does have an influence on the vertical structure. But two factors that we look at as oceanographers are temperature and salinity. And so in general, the Arctic has very cold surface water temperatures. And as you move through the water column, so move deeper into the ocean, we encounter a slightly warmer layer known as Atlantic water. So the movement of a large mass and volume of ocean water that's saltier and warmer than surface polar water that comes into the Arctic. With it comes nutrients, and it has a different nutrient profile than polar water. And then at the deep ocean, there are other currents bringing in cold, salty water below the warm Atlantic water. So while we've discussed how temperature and salinity changes in vertical space, one thing we also have to consider is the seasonal variation of temperature in the Arctic. Many of you will associate the Arctic with a frozen landscape, and for a majority of the ocean, that is true. The Arctic experiences large expanses of sea ice cover during the late fall and winter months into the spring. And so the ocean not only acts as a liquid medium for nutrients, but there's a semi-solid medium of sea ice where nutrients are also important. And so what we need to consider in understanding Arctic Ocean biogeochemistry is understanding what role sea ice plays in changing the inventory and fluxes of essential nutrients. So you're probably wondering, what are those things that you keep calling nutrients? Is there something in my everyday life that I can relate to? And my best explanation is the nutrients I'm talking about are the same types of nutrients that your garden at home needs. The plants that grow in your garden need things like nitrate, phosphate, and sometimes other trace elements. And it's nitrate and phosphate and these trace elements that combine together to support their growth. This is exactly the same type of nutrients that are needed by ocean plants like phytoplankton and sea ice alga. And of course, just like in your home garden, the Arctic Ocean and the community that uses those nutrients experience seasonal changes. When we are working in the Arctic, we're both looking at summertime productivity and wintertime preconditions of nutrients. And MOSAiC is an opportunity for us to look at that complete annual cycle within 1 year, which is unprecedented in modern sea ice studies. So first, let's consider this. Let's start in September. It's September in the Arctic. The light is just barely coming over the horizon, but there's still enough light for productivity. And the question that's pressing is there enough nutrients within the water column for phytoplankton and sea ice algae to continue to grow? We are studying this actively, not just in MOSAiC, but as part of Arctic community research. We're moving past September into the late fall, October and November. And what has happened is the sunlight has disappeared. And when there is no sunlight, organisms like phytoplankton and sea ice algae can no longer photosynthesize. They need sunlight and nutrients to photosynthesize. And when the light disappears, they begin to enter a dormant stage. What happens to the nutrients? In the upper water column, the nutrients remain, and things that are even smaller than sea ice algae, like bacteria, begin to take that organic matter and recycle it. And when that happens, it releases nutrients back into the water column and back into the ice. So one thing in these dark months, these dark and cold months that's happening is a combination of both chemical reactions and biological reactions to reintroduce nutrients into both the water column and sea ice. But biology is not the only thing that controls nutrient distributions. In the wintertime, there are many storms and wind events, and what can happen is that these storm and wind events turn or mix the upper ocean. And just like there are large currents moving large volumes of water, these events like storms actually reintroduce nutrients from the deep sea into the surface water, where there had been recently depleted nutrients because of phytoplankton growth. So our previous knowledge was that very little was happening in the winter. And what we have found with our modern observations is that there's actually a lot of activity happening in the winter. And so what we're trying to focus on now is the coupling between microbial processes and nutrient biogeochemistry to understand what those inventories of nutrients in the upper ocean may actually be like before the onset of new growth in the spring and summer in the Arctic Ocean. So after a long, cold, and dark winter, the sun begins to return. And in MOSAiC in the Central Arctic, we anticipate the sun to return in late February and into mid-March. It really depends where we are in the drift, but we know that the sun will return. And what this means is that it is like a wake-up call to all of the small organisms that utilize light. In addition, over this winter period, we know that nutrients have been regenerated and resupplied to waters and to ice layers where they had been depleted with the previous summer's growth. That being said, now the question is, what are the existing nutrient concentrations and their ratios to one another before sea ice algae and phytoplankton begin their rapid growth as soon as light returns? And this is a critical thing that we're trying to understand all across the Arctic. Each region, given its different contributions of sources of nutrients and differences in microbial communities, means that the Arctic is experiencing different rates of change in how nutrients influence primary production. In the Central Arctic, which has historically been covered with multi-year ice, we anticipate that productivity will remain very low, but our sea ice physics observations indicate that sea ice is continuing to retreat. The onset of melt is earlier in the year, the onset of freezing is later in the year, and what this creates is a very large period of time when light is available where ice is thin or non-existent. And what this allows is for small microorganisms like phytoplankton and sea ice algae to utilize now nutrients and light to grow. So predictions are that in the Central Arctic, we will see sharp increases in primary production due to reductions in sea ice. However, the controversial comment now is whether or not there will be sufficient nutrients in the upper ocean and in sea ice to support the growth of these primary producers. Well, there's different factors that play a role in that. One is certainly which organisms are present, and the other factor is how the structure of the upper ocean changes given the loss of sea ice. You can imagine, if you've ever seen this, in, say, a cup of ice water that you have at home. If you take that cup of ice water, or maybe actually a cup of juice that you place ice cubes into, and you let it sit on the table, after maybe 5-10 minutes, you will see that the ice begins to melt. And so you will have juice, let's say it's orange juice, and then the ice is melting because the ice floats on the top. And suddenly there's a thin layer of ice melt at the top of your glass of orange juice with orange juice below. This is what happens during the summer melt. And what we call this in oceanography is stratification. So what you have on the surface of the ocean is a light, fresh, less salty, less dense layer of water, which in this case is ice cube water. And below it, you have nutrient-rich orange juice. And because this stratification occurs, you can imagine that when ice begins to melt in the Arctic, you create the same type of layering. So suddenly, these small organisms may not be able to access the nutrient-rich deeper waters due to the increasing melt of sea ice. So what does this mean on the global scale? Does it matter what happens in the Arctic regarding nutrients and its role in productivity? It certainly does. Even though the Arctic is not large, what it is extremely seasonally productive. And what that means is the time of the year which the Arctic plays a big role in sequestering carbon into the ocean is the summertime. And it's sequestered into the Arctic not just by physical means of transfers of gases from the atmosphere into the upper ocean, but by the biological means of the small microorganisms of phytoplankton and sea ice algae taking up nutrients and carbon into their cells, and those cells then moving up the food chain, either by being grazed upon by small crustaceans and then by fish, or by those aggregating together and sinking to the deep sea and taking their carbon and nutrients with them. So one big question that stands out for all of the Arctic researchers is, in the future, will the Arctic be net primary productive, a net sink for carbon, or will it be a source of carbon in the future because of the loss of sea ice? So we must link these things together when we think about nutrients and its role in primary production. And the seasonal cycle is critical for understanding our gaps in knowledge. There are very few measurements in the wintertime of both nutrients and production. Most of our information and our knowledge comes from the summertime. MOSAiC is an opportunity for us to close those gaps and to understand on a full annual cycle what are the preconditions in winter that then support things like the spring and summer bloom of the Arctic Ocean, and then into the fall, are there still sufficient nutrients and organisms active enough to continue productivity later into the season than anticipated. So I've talked a lot about both the physics and the chemistry of the Arctic Ocean and sea ice, and how that can change both in horizontal space and vertical space and over time across the year. But the question is really for us who are studying ecosystem functions, does it matter who is there and which nutrients they're using, and how quickly they use them, and to what extent they use them? And the answer is yes. Who does matter, when matters, and how fast also matters. So this is something that we are actively studying all across the Arctic in different types of research programs, and certainly also in MOSAiC. So you might be wondering, who are these players that you're talking about that are using different types of nutrients? Well, one big player are known as diatoms. And diatoms exist both in sea ice and in the upper ocean. They're very special in the Arctic. The reason being that they exist all over the world, but in the Arctic, there are certain diatoms that have adapted to living associated with sea ice. And as I've described, sea ice exists for part of the year, and then as we move into the summer, sea ice disappears because it begins to melt. So how do these organisms live and adapt in an environment that is both at one time solid and at another time fluid? Well, they have all of these mechanisms within their cells that require nutrients to support. One thing is their cell walls are created with silica. And what's the easiest way to describe this? Well, there's that glass of orange juice again. The glass that you're holding in your hand that contains orange juice is the same type of material that diatoms build their cell walls out of. So we often refer to diatoms as the organisms that live in glass houses. And silica is really important. And the question is, okay, but where do you find silica in the ocean? Silica is a major component of all of the rocks on Earth. And so the delivery of silica into the Arctic primarily comes from terrestrial origins. So all of those continents surrounding the Arctic Ocean with large rivers that flow into Arctic also bring things like silica. And that essential nutrient is important for this key player in primary production, diatoms. So what else do diatoms need? Well, they also need nitrogen. And nitrogen is a nutrient that all living organisms on Earth require. So the combination of nitrogen and silica are essential for diatoms to grow and reproduce. And people often wonder, well, are diatoms the only players? No, there are other players that don't live in glass houses. And these are smaller organisms known as nanoplankton. While they need nitrogen, they don't necessarily need silica. And so this means that if we have a plankton community that's comprised primarily of diatoms versus nanoplankton, we have a different ratio of the nutrients of nitrogen being utilized compared to silica. So for instance, say that I have 10 diatom cells, and for them to grow, they need 2 essential nutrients, nitrogen and silica. You can imagine that how quickly they do that is different than 10 cells of nanoplankton, which do not require silica, but still require nitrogen. So these are the questions that we are constantly thinking about. And to answer them, it requires us to not only measure the amount of nitrogen and silica in the water and in the sea ice, but it also takes us finding out, is it 10 cells of diatoms and 10 cells of nanoplankton, or is the proportion different? And in nature, that proportion varies in time and space. And so it's never just diatoms and never just nanoplankton. It's a mixture. And this mixture means that the utilization of those essential nutrients also changes in time and space. So the diversity of organisms living in the Arctic Ocean, both in the water column and sea ice, have a direct impact on nutrient distributions of the Arctic Ocean. Now the question is what happens next? Well, what I've just described to you is what we call bottom-up control of primary producers. So just like you and I, our growth is dependent upon what we eat. But luckily for us, there are no predators. But diatoms, they do have predators. And so smaller organisms like crustaceans or small shrimp eat diatoms and nanoplankton. And in addition, those small crustaceans and small shrimp serve as food for things like fish. And fish serve as food for things like seals and birds. And ultimately, in the Arctic, seals and fish serve as food for polar bears. So the nutrients that we've talked about today, that we cannot see, that are dissolved in sea ice and dissolved in the upper ocean, drive the full community of organisms that we can see, all the way up to polar bears. So it's important for us to not just think about the Arctic from the sense of animal communities, but also to understand the chemistry of the ocean and how it relates to productivity. So on the one hand, the health of an ecosystem and its functions definitely depend on the organisms that live there and their interactions. But also, it depends on how these organisms interact with their physical and chemical environment. The Central Arctic is experiencing rapid change. The loss of sea ice in the Arctic is unprecedented. These organisms rely upon sea ice not just as a habitat and a place to grow, but also in how sea ice structures nutrient distributions, which funnel the base of the food web. So as sea ice changes and the upper ocean water column changes, what we change are nutrient distributions. And since nutrient distributions dictate the presence and growth and the rate of growth of essential organisms like sea ice algae and phytoplankton, it has long-standing and long-term impacts on what we can envision being the distributions of organisms like fish, seals, birds, and polar bears. So this is why you should care about nutrient biogeochemistry of the Arctic. It has a central role in our whole understanding of ecosystem functions. So now I've taken you, hopefully, what you consider a really interesting journey through nutrient biogeochemistry of the Arctic and how it's controlled by physical processes like the stratification of the ocean and ocean currents, and by biological processes by understanding organisms that utilize nutrients and how those nutrients are transferred through the food web. I'd just like to conclude and say, keep track of our progress in MOSAiC and join us again for another interesting exploration of the Arctic Ocean and its ecosystems.